Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 81, Lightning Devastation. It wasn't hard to get to the doors, a straight path after descending a small flight of stairs. The bigger problem was the small army of changed humans. Killing them was one thing, and with Red and Luke, they could survive their attacks, but it felt wrong. With the knowledge that they were people, it made it harder to commit to carving their way past them. We have to do it. It's the only way to save everyone else, and you all know it. Red spoke up, meeting each of their faces in turn. The words were true but didn't make the situation any better. Jill said as much too. I don't care if I know it. I still can't. She didn't finish her statement, instead, she shut her mouth leaving the rest unsaid. Mash knew what she wanted to say, but kept his mouth closed as well. No words would change their actions. Earlier, Jill had teleported Luke beside the half-turned child, to see if he could heal them with his soul magic, but it didn't work. Whatever the changes had done to them, had broken their souls as well. The way Luke described it made it sound like their souls were torn apart like scraps of paper. Mash wondered if the attack that had hit him had done the same, but Luke said he didn't know since they had dealt with it so quickly. Mash decided he would treat these people as already being dead and stepped down the stairs. The others followed somberly behind him. He thought of something and spoke aloud for the benefit of his friends. Priscilla, please give me the biggest, most powerful attack you can think of. The others looked at him but nodded along in agreement. They didn't care about the levels or rewards, instead just wanting to finish this quickly. Luke and Jill would fall behind, as they lacked powerful area attacks like Mash and Red, but they gave no protest to his plan. None of them wanted to kill these people, even if the class system was being generous with its levels. Priscilla told him that it would take a minute and would drain him rapidly. Any monsters that lived would likely rush towards them, but he didn't care. Jill, Luke, and Red could handle those and followed her outline with his energy. It started by forming a large version of Priscilla but mutated into a broken mess where the mouth would normally be. It was smaller than he expected but the internal design was different from anything he had done before. Lightning bounced around inside as he started producing it. More and more energy vibrated within his creation, parts of the lightning were visible through the wood. Quickly, faster than ever before, he had drained the majority of his energy. Priscilla didn't stop though and continued to ask for more. Mash followed her instructions, as she sent him the message. Don't stop, keep pouring energy out. Even after your skill triggers, try to resist falling unconscious for as long as possible. Priscilla sounded strained but managed to send the message across clearly. Without any reason to disagree, Mash did so, feeling the effects of persist kick in during the process. When it happened, he felt like he could go forever but knew why he shouldn't. The more energy he used after the skill was triggered, the longer he would be unconscious for. So, he stopped when he felt like it would be too dangerous to continue, letting the unconsciousness of the skill claim him. He would leave the rest to the others. Luke's P.O.V. Luke had never seen this creation from Mash, and he shivered a bit at the sinister design. After getting to know Mash, Luke knew that he wasn't a monster or evil, but his techniques were all monstrous. This one was particularly bad. It started as a normal replica of Priscilla. It was weird that he was familiar to those now, but it had changed into a broken head section with many sharp points sprouting from where the head would be. Furthermore, it sounded like it was growling as he poured his mana into it. It shook too, making it feel particularly alive, and even without a skill for it, he knew not to stand near that thing. Red wanted to fire a volley of blood needles but needed to get prepared for the melee that would follow Mash's attack. Even with all of Mash's power, he couldn't kill all the monsters here. That was a frightening notion, as he saw Mash kill over 1,000 monsters yesterday. Luke knew that he was not the powerhouse of the group and recognized that Mash was the best against hordes of monsters, but yesterday's fight had been ridiculous. That was not something anyone at their rank should be able to accomplish. Luke would normally write something like that off as Mash's luck in his skills and items, but he knew better than that. Mash trained inhumanely hard and sought out every opportunity to get stronger. His idea of a break had been to train under Jack and explore dungeons. This visit to the capital had quickly become just as busy as their usual routine, maybe even busier. Well, that was a topic he could bring up later. For now, he watched as Mash's creation seemed to be changing color from the power within, a bluish tint shining within the wood. Luke watched the monsters. There were easily over 100 of the things, and they were lined up nicely for Mash's attack. In an instant he was blinded, a white light erupting from somewhere. His eyes stung, and he started healing them reflexively. But then a sound came, and he fell backward as his eardrums burst. Luke barely thought, activating his buffs and starting to heal himself rapidly. Someone had attacked them, and Mash had been completely vulnerable. Panicked, he sprung to his feet in a quick motion, waiting for his eyes to heal. It only took a few heartbeats to heal, but it felt like it lasted an eternity. Then he saw it and froze, realization dawning on him. They had not been attacked, it was the opposite. Mash's attack had been so powerful, that they were damaged by the residual effects of it. Red was already moving heal Mash, whose ears were bleeding freely. He was the closest to the attack, and was in urgent need of care, as he had no energy to heal his own wounds. Luke grabbed Jill, who was shaking her head and stumbling about blindly. He had to dodge as she almost attacked him, though she managed to stop herself when the healing started. Luke looked over the battlefield next, taking in the sight that he had glimpsed before. Most of the monsters were dead, the floors and walls scored with burns, and some metal had even started melting in places. The front of Mash's weapon was torn to pieces, but it had done its jobs. The monsters that got hit were simply missing parts of their body, and every creature at least seemed damaged by the attack. A few were missing their human portions, and some had holes pushing through their entire body. Others were burned husks of once living creatures, and several were letting out wails of pain. He didn't know that they could make those sounds. None of the sights could compare to the smell though. The smell of burning hair and flesh was intense, flooding his nostrils. He could feel the bile rising but kept it down. He would soon be in the thick of it, fighting those things at close range. At first, they had been concerned about him doing that, but they had tested it in the orphanage, and they found that whatever their attacks didn't break through his soul defense skill. That fact would mean that he would be the sole defense for this fight, and he had to protect an unconscious Mash. The monsters didn't rush them though, they still seemed stunned by the attack Mash had fired. Luke couldn't blame the things. Mash's attack had to have been at least 1 or 2 ranks above what he should have been able to manage. If they could do that again for the warden, he didn't think it would be much of a worry. In fact, they should probably do something like that for other dungeons as well. Although, that wouldn't help the rest of them gain levels. Luke was curious to see how many levels Mash would gain from that attack, but that was a concern for later. He needed to clean up the rest of the things. It wasn't difficult to work to kill the remaining monsters, as they were mostly still stunned by Mash's attack. The work was grueling though, as it involved trudging through patches of burning goopy flesh and killing monsters that only fought back when they got close. Any one of them could handle the monsters in a one-on-one fight and did exactly that, killing the monsters 3 at a time. It took around 10 minutes to finish the remaining monsters, and each of them had gained at least 2 levels from the remaining monsters. That was a lot considering each fight was easy, and there weren't that many monsters left. It really did seem like the class system or the one who made it was being generous to them for some reason. Luke guessed it probably had to with Mash, it was an assumption that tended to work in most situations. Honestly, that was one of the reasons Luke liked sticking with Mash. He seemed to have a talent for finding himself in complex situations. Sure, they were in danger a lot, but he truly felt like he was living the life of an adventurer with Mash. Even if there were some bad parts, Luke didn't think he would want to go back. He had asked around the past couple of days, trying to find a house for his parents. On the first day, he was simply refused and not allowed to purchase any of the houses around where Mash's family was. However, the kingdom sellers changed their tunes as they realized who Luke was associated with. From Mash's family to his newfound position, Luke had several of the sellers he met with giving him incredible deals on the homes. He made his way back to Mash now, excited to hear about how many levels he gained. Mash's P.O.V. Well, the result was expected and unexpected at the same time. Mash had killed a lot of the creatures, that much was obvious based on the carnage he saw below. He watched as his friends finished off the remaining monsters, amazed by the devastation of his attack. Priscilla had informed him that he managed to achieve the same power as her attack from before, and he was shocked to hear that. He didn't think he could manage that without the wyvern scale, but it seemed unnecessary now. The biggest concern for him now was leveling and recovery. For some reason or another, they had been gaining levels more rapidly within this dungeon and bet that his brother was in a similar situation. Not to mention the fact that his brother was able to enter the other dungeon, meant that these dungeons were actually for a rank above them. Either that or this wasn't a real dungeon and there was another reason for the expedient level UPS. Too many questions, but now was not the time to figure out answers. Priscilla's agitation at his aimless thoughts only reminded him of the fact. Focusing inwards, he started the level up. Name, MASH class, Scale Wood Devourer. Level, 51 to 54. Health, 1190/1300. Energy, 79/2000. Fortitude, 124 to 124 plus 6 to 130. Endurance, 82. Strength, 80 to plus 5 to 85. Agility, 80 to plus 4 to 84. Intelligence, 120 to 121. Wisdom, 71. Charisma, 65. Free stats, 0 to 15 to 0. Chapter 82, The Warden's Trials. 3 levels from a single fight, well, more like a single attack. At his level, he wondered how many people could accomplish the same feat. Then he remembered the flaming sword of the hero, or his brother's ice blade, and figured they could have done the same to this group of enemies. Though he doubted their attacks would be as explosive as his. Not that it was necessarily a good point, as he wiped the blood from his cheeks. As soon as he came to, Red had told him what his attack did, and he was most stunned by the damage he had done to himself. He dragged himself off the ground slowly, using a little energy to form something to prop his back against. Red had healed him enough to move, but his body felt strained. It was as if he had sprinted non-stop for days, and only just managed to collapse. So, it had taken a significant amount of effort to sit up. Wasting no more energy, he started meditating with his inhuman hibernation skill. This was one of his strongest skills in his opinion, since it healed him in his entirety. His fatigue and strain were washed away by the magic, though it did take several minutes. He was probably taking his situation too lightly, but he just wasn't worried about a surprise attack in here. His mana territory had enough range that he could react to any attack that entered. And if he couldn't, it simply meant the attack was unavoidable for him either way. He meditated until he felt Luke enter the range of his skill and opened his eyes to him in greeting. The gesture was enough, as Luke had been looking at Mash before approaching him. Mash saw the others too, an expectant gleam in all of their eyes. Mash held his hand up, sticking out 3 fingers proudly. Jill didn't seem impressed, and her response told him why. Honestly, I expected more. That's how many I got from cleaning up your scraps. She winced as she finished her sentence, saying a silent apology to the used-to-be humans. That apology reminded Mash of what his attack had really accomplished. He had ended the lives of over 100 innocent people, and that was after they had undergone a torturous transformation. He was not a paragon of righteousness, and he knew it, but this was a bit much even for his sensibilities. The class system did little to ease his turmoil, and Mash realized that his earrings were the things that let him remain calm. Mash was a little surprised to hear that Jill had gained the same number of levels. Even though she was a few levels lower, he didn't see many living monsters when he came to, and doubted that she could have killed more than 20. The fact that it had been enough to gain 3 levels supported his theory that this dungeon was a special case for one reason or another. Mash pushed the thoughts out and stood up. He found his footing easily, his recovery having finished while his friends fought. One more room to go. Hopefully. Mash spoke clearly, the tiredness having washed away completely. His friends though weren't of the same opinion and chastised him loudly. It degraded to them, throwing insults at him while they sat down and began their own recovery. Mash stood guard, avoiding looking at the devastation created from his attack. He didn't want to consider the number of people that had been killed by his attacks. Shaking his head, he tried to think about it in a different way. After struggling with it for a while, he settled for thinking that they were already dead and that he was freeing them from the torture. He couldn't make himself fully believe that though, and considered whether he caused this with his fate. The damn knowledge of his future caused him to struggle with all the events that happened around him. Surely, he couldn't be blamed for them, but each time something happened it caused him to remember the world carrier's words. Too many things were happening around him, and he didn't believe it could all be a coincidence. The obvious events revolved within his mind, and he was stuck ruminating on the thoughts. His family was famous, each of his siblings had powerful classes that destined them for bright futures, but a part of his mind warned him that they had received them for a reason. They were too connected to Mash and were similarly intertwined with his fate. His friends and the events that they were pulled into were obvious enough, each dungeon visit having been chaotic in one way or another. Even the capital visit had become much more complicated, from the mysterious items to the tournament. It really seemed like he was at the center of a jumble of string, and each thread was another chaotic event. Each event didn't break him though, and he had only grown stronger from each event. It was to the point that he was growing more worried about those around him rather than himself. The gap wasn't that wide right now, but his rate of growth and desire for it was beyond what the others could keep up with. However, he didn't want to leave them behind either. Seeing his friends do one thing or another to help them recover, Mash thought about what he could do to help them keep up. His mind wandered to different plans, and before he knew it his friends had finished their recovery. Once they were ready, the group departed. It was a longer walk than Mash expected, and he got to see the full damage his attack had inflicted. This close to the viscera, he could smell the burning pieces of flesh, and the melted misshapen metal from the heat. The walk had shown him some of the power that one of his rank could achieve. Considering what he had managed, lead him to think about what those above him could do. How did the kingdom maintain peace, when at his level he could destroy a small town? The question bothered him more than he thought it would, having never really considered the damage that simply having power could cause. Mash believed that this was one of the reasons that classes had become so guided with time. One of the ways the kingdom maintained order was through various methods of controlling what classes the general public ended up with. Mash stopped his thoughts from wandering, taking advantage of his earrings to refocus on the upcoming fight. The door was indeed as large as he expected, each standing over triple his height. The size didn't bother him too much, and he knew that it could be opened by any of them. Well, maybe not Jill since her strength hadn't improved much recently. Luke pushed open the doors, everyone else was prepared to launch some attack into the entrance. It was unneeded though, and Mash was greeted by an empty room. It was a large empty circle, several pathways indicated that he needed to move to the center of the room. Mash didn't notice anything dangerous, the metal floor was simply painted on, white lines drawing out the pathway. Once they got to the center, the paint on the floor lit up and they saw several white circles lighting up in the distance. Mash didn't know what was happening but saw the first monsters appear in the circles at the distance. They were more abominations of humans mixed with another creature. A few were like the spider people from earlier, but he also saw some that were awkwardly attached to wolves and dogs. Each creation was vile, and their movements disturbed him. He was stuck staring at the monster and only started attacking when his earrings kicked in. Normally, he had trouble feeling the effect, but the past few instances had been such a drastic change from his thought process that it was noticeable. Priscilla was quick on the uptake and formed a simple outline for him. Lightning was not necessary yet, and he formed a series of rushing blades that crawled across the ground. It stabbed into the wolf body of the first monster, collapsing from his magic, and the human head got trampled under the feet of another. When the first monster died, he heard the laughter start. The scene reminded him of the Colosseum, but it was much more gruesome and depressing than he remembered. These monsters weren't very dangerous when they killed them at a distance, only letting Luke handle the nearby monsters. Somehow, he was impervious to the weird effect that caused his body to twist, and they were able to butcher the monsters easily. Mash was uncertain if these creatures would have the same effect as the ones outside, but nobody would test it as it was obviously too dangerous. It didn't take long to be surrounded by a series of corpses, and he saw the creature that was laughing in the distance. As he suspected, it was the thing that had laughed at him earlier, and he saw it behind some kind of glass wall. Its appearance startled Mash, as it was wearing some kind of cloth. Long white robes draped from its body going out of sight beneath where the glass ended. Since Mash could see the creature so clearly, even at this distance he figured it was large enough to use the doors like they were appropriately sized. The smile was wide, and it did in fact bend upwards until it split the eyes into two parts. It was humanoid to an extent, as in he could identify all the parts a human would typically have, but it all seemed out of place and unordinary. It had more than just the 4 eyes, and he counted 7 before stopping. Mash thought that he saw another pop up when he finished with the previous one and realized that it was messing with him. It acted like some kind of oversized child, each of his actions only causing him more discomfort. It revolted him more as he thought about it and focused on the next set of monsters that arrived. These were opposite to the previous creatures who were more beast than human. These were much more humanoid, with only a few animalistic features. They were even dressed in ways that made their attack styles obvious. At least he thought so until one of the ones with a magical staff ran at him, and another with a great sword started channeling a spell. Rolling his eyes at the image, Mash leaped from his circle. It was clear that standing in the center wasn't helping him, and instead chose to fully encase his body with wood. He pulled his mask from his storage space and fit it as a faceplate from the wooden armor. It clung to his body like a thick bodysuit, the scales and scars giving it a ghastly appearance. He slammed into the melee wizard and was surprised when he was thrown back from the force. Whatever this thing was, it was stronger than him by a lot, and he instead channeled his energy into forming 2 enormous tails that replicated Priscilla. It stabbed into the wizard, able to pierce through its robes easily. Then the mouth opened and ripped the body in half. Mash quickly made some guesses about the situation, as the creation devoured the remains. The wizard fired a simple fireball, but it lacked the same power as the fighter and confirmed his suspicions. This was enough to make him realize that this wall was just a game. He turned again facing the glass pane in the distance. A plan sprung in his head as he saw it, and Mash left his opponents stumbling behind and headed towards Jill. Chapter 83, What He's Good At. Once Mash got into the earshot of Jill, he yelled trying to get her attention. Though it didn't work as she teleported further away. Annoyed at his inability to get her attention, he aimed a harmless attack at her. Her forewarning rings should let her see the attack long in advance, and hopefully get her to react. It was a simple attack where Priscilla had him form a narrow twig, that was dulled at the ends. It didn't even trigger her items, it seemed, as the twig bounced against her back. It did manage to get her attention and she teleported beside him, obviously angry that he stopped her easy fight. Get the warden, otherwise we're going to have to deal with it while exhausted. He didn't actually know if that was true or not, but felt like this fight was accomplishing nothing. The creature's unnatural laughter only confirmed that fact for him. It didn't look weak though, whereas these monsters seemed stupid. Take Red and Luke too, prioritize finishing the boss. Mash's voice echoed beneath his mask and armor, even with him opening the mask to let his words pass. It was ignorable though, and Mash got the words across. Jill looked like she was going to argue but thought better of it and nodded. Mash could handle a horde of mindless monsters. If anything, it was his specialty. Jill knew that, and so did the others. The final fight would not be his fight, and he was sure that would annoy the creature. It seemed to dislike how Mash could find the creature and clearly singled him out. So, his best plan and the cruelest plan was to pass it to the others. He would not give the creature what it wanted. Mash heard the laughter cut off and knew that Jill had probably gone to engage the enemy. Mash did something else and headed back towards the center. The monstrous imitations of typical classes rushed towards him, but none of them moved particularly fast, and he was able to make his preparations. Mash was in his full armor, and grew blades out from the elbows, and formed his weapon to be particularly long. Furthermore, he gave himself 2 additional arms, each of which didn't have a hand and instead had a dragonoid maw meant to devour his opponents. This was only the beginning, and he started following Priscilla's instructions for forming tails behind him. He didn't need as many as with the ants, since these things wouldn't burn his wood like the ants. Each of those was a copy of Priscilla, as it was the easiest shape for her to direct. Mash had learned a lot since the fight with ants, the first of which was how much effort Priscilla actually put in for each fight. Apparently making the outline was several times harder than just casting the spell, and he struggled a lot when doing the same. It had taken him a few minutes to form a single outline, and he truly got a grasp at how great her mana control really was. That was not even to mention that it would only improve as her new bodies formed, the next of which should be completed before his tournament fight. The information had actually made him excited, knowing that none at his rank would be able to keep up with Priscilla. So he followed the outlines more gratefully now and watched as the imitations of Priscilla devastated the battlefield around him. They sought out the mages, tearing them apart as they got close. The things fired spells at Mash, but their accuracy wasn't very good. It was not to say he got out easily, a spear of ice having slammed into him while he was distracted by a melee fighter. The fighter was quite annoying, as he used a bow at point-blank range. It didn't even use it as a club, but as a spear, and threw arrows at him with the other hand. It was extremely annoying, and several arrows had managed to puncture his armor. This thing's strength was otherworldly. Mash didn't understand why it was so physically powerful, as it was clear that its inhuman head belonged on a squirrel. It was not a very intimidating sight, but every missed arrow created a boom where it landed, and each stab of the spear shook the air. It was faster and more capable than the other creatures, but still not fast enough to land any hits, and his rising stats would eventually give him an advantage. That was until the spear of ice hit his foot and stopped his movements. He was glad that persist wasn't active, but it still made him vulnerable to the thrust of the thing. The other melee fighters had been distracted with the dragon-like maws, but the spearman landing a hit caused him to stumble into the range of the other fighters. Well, he didn't really stumble so much as flying through the air. The force was incredible for 2 reasons. The first was that his armor didn't really get pierced as much as it got dented in by the force of the blow, and crushed his ribs beneath. Thankfully though, the wound was actually fairly minor other than broken bones, and the pain was something he could manage. Several tools he had helped him deal with pain, and a few broken bones weren't that bad. It was much better than the twisting from earlier. These thoughts passed through his mind in less than a second, before he slammed into another monster. Spikes grew from the back of his armor in between the gaps formed by the tails, and they stabbed into the creature, using the force of the throw to his advantage. The thing he collided with died instantly, but two others lashed out at him. One was fast, but the other was just incompetent. The speedy one landed a hit with a dagger, actually having a weapon appropriate for its style made its strike more effective. The blade slipped into his armor but didn't cut him anywhere vital. None of the creatures were very smart, and just attacked wherever they could, so the dagger actually hit his arm, and got stuck in his armor. He didn't bother taking it out for now and continued the fight smoothly. He flung off from the creature and released the spikes on his back as he dashed towards the slower creature. The faster one had a narrow face of a canine, though he didn't recognize it. It dashed at his back mindlessly when he turned away from it, but he expected the obvious attack. The creatures had some level of intelligence, but none were smarter than a silly beast. As it got close, one of the dragon maws formed from the back of his armor and launched at the thing. The crunching of its head could be heard as he cut the incompetent monster's head clean off. The squirrel-like one had closed the distance at this point, but Mash was prepared to fight it. Or rather, Priscilla was, as one of her replicas slammed into the thing's side. Mash instead dashed toward the group of mages in front of him. He dodged another spear of ice and saw that it was made by something with a wolf's head. Mash dashed toward the group, and sped up drastically, as his persist skill finally triggered. He felt like it was early, and glanced behind him with the added stats. The glance had told him why his energy drained so quickly. Each replica of Priscilla was enormous, several times larger than she had been when she was a boss. She was fully taking advantage of the fact that this would be the final fight and ignored all concerns about the recoil from the skill. His bonus stats let him see more clearly, and Mash caught a glimpse of one of the replicas crushing an entire group of mages. He leveled from the attack, but that wasn't all that surprising to him. His improved stats had made the remainder of this group easy, and he cut through the mages as he dodged their blows. Compared to their sluggish motions, he was essentially untouchable and plowed through the abominations. The fight wasn't over though as the floor lit up again, even though there were still a few of the abominations left over from the previous fight. This time only 3 monsters appeared and he felt like this was the final group of creatures. This was the worst thing so far as well, and he threw up when he saw it. Since he was stuck in motion, his vomit would have spewed out from the opening he made within his mask. However, there was no food in him and he was merely wretched. The creatures were hideous, and the smell filled the room quickly. They were masses of flesh, random parts connecting to form enormous blobs of moving limbs. When one of his creations slammed into the nearest one, the floor shook, but it didn't die. Instead, it caught the wooden creation, and hundreds of hands and mouths started tearing up the wood. Mash wasn't all that worried and ran towards that same one. He couldn't do much himself but figured he could start carving into it. Run! Priscilla gave him the warning, though he didn't need it as he saw the creature launch a miniature assortment of limbs at one of the remaining mages. As soon as they landed they tore the thing apart in a few seconds. The strength of the attack was obviously ridiculous. Running away, he let Priscilla handle the attacking. He could tell what she was doing and knew that she had given up on attacking the remaining mages and moved all of the creations to attack the larger creature. There were 3, but she focused on one at a time. It didn't seem to matter though, as it merely took the attacks. Though, he finally heard a different noise than fingers crawling against the ground and turned around to see the thing disperse. He let the rush of a level up, but also realized the limbs that were pouring across the ground had not stopped moving. One arm had managed to touch him, and he started feeling the twisting sensation again. It started on his armor and ended there, as he dislodged the entire leg section, and jumped away. This was going to be a problem and he knew it. Already a quarter of the ground was covered in these limbs, and there were still another 2 creatures remaining. He needed more indiscriminate damage and realized what he needed to do. Lightning storm. Priscilla's glee was palpable, and she stopped controlling 3 of the replicas to focus on the lightning. The replicas simply broken off, and were left scattered on the ground, as only one was still moving. Now she slammed it into one of the creatures. On the other hand, Mash had already started forming lightning wildly around him, and she slowly increased the range and power with her outlines. Within a few seconds, Mash was dancing in a mindless swirl of lightning that bounced between the limbs on the ground. He was performing a simple training exercise, but the lightning was killing the moving limbs on the ground as he moved among them. The range of his storm kept rising too. It was a powerful attack at dealing small amounts of damage in repetition but was very useful for this situation. The storm of lightning kept growing until it encompassed the entire room, and he let it as his friends were not nearby. The lightning hit everything in the room, and eventually, even the larger creatures died. He leveled again when the final creature died, but he didn't stop moving. He did stop the lightning storm though and made his way towards the glass wall from earlier. Mash was a bit surprised to see that the fight wasn't over, and slammed the remaining replica of Priscilla into the glass trying to get the warden behind it. It did manage to break through the glass, but the boss caught the replica, and the whole thing twisted violently as it collapsed. When that happened, Mash realized why the boss had been such a problem. Luke was the only one that could get close safely, and a single touch of the large boss would be deadly to anyone else. That did not mean the boss was uninjured though, and Mash could see that several of its eyes were bloody messes, and it had a section of its side missing. The glass was broken and the creature dashed out into the arena, the limbs and pieces of flesh being absorbed into the thing's body. As the monster grew larger, Jill's yell echoed in the room. "God damn it, Mash!" Chapter 84, What the? Jill's yell was unnecessary. Mash could already tell that he had messed up, just looking at the monster absorbing the limbs was enough to tell him that. The scattered somewhat charred limbs were dragged into the thing's feet as it stepped over them. The monster's feet were round discs, where large toes surrounded them like petals of a flower. Honestly, while it was a disturbing sight, it was nowhere near the most disgusting thing in this dungeon. It didn't heal either, and instead, it just grew new parts and limbs. The bleeding eyes were still bleeding, blue blood pouring into its deranged smile. The hole in its side was completely ignored too, the creature simply growing in size. Mash couldn't stop moving, but with buffs from Persist, he was confident in dodging the creature. They obviously didn't let the creature recover, and Jill appeared above the boss with Luke, letting him fall onto the boss. Luke grew larger as he came down, his buffs shining around him. Luke grew larger, and Mash realized that his skills were eerily similar to the boss's. They were both altering their bodies through some manipulation of their souls. That got Mash to realize why necromancers were so feared. This boss was essentially a glorified child and had trapped hundreds of humans and made many of them into monsters. If such a mindless boss could accomplish this, then he could only guess what a real lich could accomplish. Luke being called a hero made sense now. Even without a special weapon or title, it was clear that he was one of the only people who could fight a lich. The undead continent's existence made a lot more sense to Mash, as even powerful people would be unable to do much against a lich. And Luke had basically promised to attempt to deal with that. He was both excited and terrified of going there with Luke at some point. Luke came down with an overhand swing of an extremely enlarged axe. Mash had forgotten about the weapon but didn't think that would happen again as it split the monster's head in two with a thunderous crash as it hit its back. Mash was stunned to see small arms stopping the blade. From both halves of the creature's head sprouted hundreds of arms that grabbed at the axe stopping. Luke was easily half the size of the boss but was held easily. Luke's weapon was stuck, and hands quickly grew out to grab him. Mash was horrified to see the monster start to absorb Luke. They obviously wouldn't let that happen, and a large blade of blood cut the boss's extra arms letting Luke leap away. The axe stayed lodged in the creature's head, though it didn't seem to mind in the slightest. Mash started forming draconic maws from wood. Currently, he didn't have the power to beat the boss, but there was nothing to say that wouldn't change if he gained some more stats. Rather than a few larger creations, he made many smaller ones, launching them at the boss like a volley of arrows. Red started doing the same on the other side, though she used a larger single weapon as she didn't have his unlimited energy. Mash wasn't focusing on dealing damage like she was though, just trying to tear off chunks of the creature. Most of his creations twisted and broke when the boss could react to them, but a few came away with chunks of the boss. None were larger than a handful, but it was what he was aiming for. Some of the creations devoured the flesh themselves, giving him a slow gradual boost to his stats, but not all. He was bringing flesh to himself in a steady stream. He wasn't looking forward to eating them and was still worried about the twisting effect. His skill though stated that it removed the negative effects of what he ate, so he guessed that it wouldn't affect him. Holding back his vomit, he stuffed the first piece into his mouth. He didn't really care about how it looked, but he couldn't help but see himself within his mana territory. It looked like he was in a deep kiss with the wooden creation, and he was glad to see that the others were too distracted with the fight to see him. Otherwise, he was sure they would tease him about it. He had to stop himself from laughing as he tried to eat the creature's flesh. That was easy as the revolting taste crushed his laughter. It was slimy and turned into a sticky goo as he swallowed it. Not to mention that it was extremely salty and made him gag as he swallowed it. It felt like his entire throat was coated by the material. He kept it down though, and let the buffs fill him. Compared to letting his creations eat the flesh, the gain from eating a portion directly was noticeably greater. Despite his better judgment, he continued to eat the thing, with the improved stats and greater concentration letting him make more and more little draconic mouths. He was essentially a moving bush, dozens of branches sprouting draconic mouths lashing at the abomination. Rather than just coming from his back, they came from all around him, so that he could attack while doing his full range of motion. The others had their own plans too, and they had managed to rip one of the arms off the creature. Though it didn't make the fight easier as the arm thrashed wildly, consuming whatever flesh it touched to grow larger. It was just another thing that they needed to worry about. Mash was growing increasingly worried that they didn't have the techniques to kill the boss. One of the rules everyone knew about the class system was that there was no such thing as invincibility, but he knew that monsters were bound by that system. Who knew what abilities this thing had? Luke though didn't seem affected, yelling loudly to the others. "Distract it, I think I need to attack its soul." His voice boomed as his added size made the voice deeper and echo in the room. Each word itself caused Mash to wince as the sound hurt his ears. He felt worse for Red, who was standing near Luke, and from a quick glance at her face, she didn't look happy. Mash felt bad for her because this was likely the second time her eardrums had been damaged by her friends. Mash still felt bad about that, especially when he heard about how they were all blinded and deafened by his attack. Trying the only other thing he had, Mash switched to focusing on lightning. The dragon maws latched onto the boss and he channeled his lightning through them. It wasn't great, but it did seem to stun the boss. Although, it didn't look like it was doing any damage either. However, its movements did slow as he continuously channeled lightning into it. The shocks were visible to him, and he could see parts of its skin burn, not that it got even a small reaction out of the creature. Luke took that moment to rush the boss again. He thrust his hand into the boss, and for the first time, Mash heard a guttural yell from the creature. It was a horrid sound of hundreds of different pitches screaming all at once. The boss grew panicked as its hundreds of eyes focused on the arm that punctured its chest. The creature launched out waves of its mana, and he saw the arms around the thing twist and break into visceral explosions. The smile that it had broken and tore apart its already split head divided into more pieces. The image was horrific as its head was split into pieces that were barely connected to its body through thin strands of flesh. Teeth and eyes fell out, as it made the new face. Mash didn't think that anything could be more disgusting than the big masses of limbs from earlier, but this was worse. A lot worse. Mash didn't need any other signal and turned and ran as fast as he could. He was worried about Luke and the others but couldn't risk going to help. He just ran, into a corner of the room, able to move much faster than attack. He didn't know what to do about that attack, although Priscilla had an idea. Just push its mana back with your own. Normally, that wouldn't work forever unless someone had an unreasonable amount of mana. After all, the person would need a near unlimited amount to even attempt this. Mash was very surprised to feel the tone of the message. Did she really need to say all that, now of all times? Was this a poorly timed attempt at improving his mood? He really hoped not, as it didn't change his impression of the situation. This is really not the time. She didn't seem to care of his retort and had already begun showing him what he needed to do. Essentially, he would need to push his mana out continuously. The plan was to counter the boss with raw amounts of mana. He started his motions, using his weapon as a focus point, and sent a continuous stream of mana outside of his body. It spun with his motions, clashing with a wave of its own. Mash was surprised to see that his mana was so dense now that it colored his surroundings. His mana was a mix of dark blues and greens, whereas the other creature's wave was still invisible. This meant that he would have an easier time resisting the thing's attack and he was able to push against the wave. The clash was visible, and the two different forces constantly exploded against one another. Mash could feel the outer parts of his mana twisting into an explosion, but that actually helped him resist the thing's spell. It was like parting a river, and waves of the thing's mana rolled past him. He felt Jill and Red arrive behind him, but he couldn't control his mana to avoid them, and they were barraged by the mana too. With their armors, the damage he could deal was minimal, especially considering the twisting effect of the creature. Mash checked their condition and realized that Red was missing a leg. It seemed like she had cut it from the middle of her thigh and replaced it with a bloody imitation. Jill seemed uninjured but was exhausted, and he could barely see what was happening with Luke. Mash watched as Luke's arm began to twist rapidly, and his heart rate quickened. Luke was going to die, that was the first thought that flashed into his mind. Luke didn't twist though, instead, the monster started twisting, as if it was being affected by its own attack. It didn't seem prepared either and instantly collapsed in on itself, exploding into a mess of limbs and parts. Luke's arm was blasted away, but so was the other creature. Mash even felt the rush of a level up, letting him know the thing had finally died. Mash didn't hesitate and moved towards Luke. If he stopped moving, he would fall unconscious, but first, he needed to make sure Luke was okay. That final attack had started affecting Luke, and Mash worried that more than just his arm was torn up. Jill beat him there though, Red by her side. As Jill finished the teleport, she fell on her back seeming completely drained. Luke didn't seem tired at all and started healing both his arm and Red's leg. When Mash saw the healing start, relief washed over him like a waterfall. He stopped moving, as he recognized that his friends would be okay. He could ask Luke about what had happened later. For now, he slammed into the ground, falling completely unconscious. The metal did not make for a soft landing, and he thudded roughly, as darkness swarmed his vision. Chapter 85, Missing Key. Mash woke and jumped to his feet. He had seen the fight end, but his thoughts were muddled, and he stood for an enemy that was not there. Soon the previous events caught up to him, and he remembered Luke managing to kill the thing somehow. Whatever technique he used had reversed the monster's technique, destroying it in the same way it did to others. Mash's lips turned up slightly, thinking about how the thing deserved its death. However, he wished he could have done more to harm the creature, but remembering its death wails, he figured it died painfully enough. Quickly he looked over his friends' conditions. They all seemed fine but were staring at him and looking around. They probably guessed that he had sensed an enemy, or a trap, or something. Mash shook his head towards them, returning to his seat while he spoke. "Sorry, it was nothing. My mind was just a bit muddled when I passed out." They slumped visibly, though none of them had even stood up earlier. Mash realized that his friends were more drained than he was at this point. Mash also took off his mask, no longer needing a faceplate to protect himself from the random touches of the monsters. Honestly, if another monster arrived, he doubted whether any of them could muster the strength to fight it. Mash should be able to manage it with persist. He still had some energy he could work with and checked his status to confirm the fact. His head spun as the information entered his mind. Name, Mash. Class, Scale Wood Devourer. Level, 54 to 59. Health, 589/1400. Energy, 23/2150. Fortitude, 130 to +10 to 140. Endurance, 82 to 85. Strength, 85 to 86 +1 to 87. Agility, 83 to 85 +5 to 90. Intelligence, 121 to +9 to 130. Wisdom, 71 to 73. Charisma, 65. Free stats, 0 to 25 to 0. Skills, Persist, Monowood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Mana Territory, Unnatural Monster Core, Inhumanity, Wooden Body, Carnivorous Tree. Mana Territory, passive. Your eyes just weren't enough. Sense the changes in the mana around you. Connect to the mana in your space and inherently understand the nature of the mana. Current range, 13 feet to 14 feet. As he processed the information, Mash's mouth fell open at the levels he had gained. 5 levels were insane, even considering that he killed most of the enemies by himself and helped with the boss. Still, this fight didn't seem like it was enough for so many levels. This change astonished him, and he quickly turned to the others. "How many levels did you guys gain?" They looked confused at first. Obviously, they had been too tired to even think about checking their status. Luke visibly shook when he checked his, and Mash wondered what had happened. Luke didn't miss Mash's stare and replied hesitantly. "I gained 9 levels and a new skill. It was the monsters." Luke's voice was shaking as he spoke, and it took Mash a second to notice the water pouring down his face. At first, the tears had mixed with his sweat hiding them, but his voice gave away his real feelings. Mash turned towards the others, but they clearly looked just as concerned. Red slid slightly closer to Luke, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "What happened? You know that we won't care." Red's concern was obvious, and her genuine tone seemed to reach Luke. He still hesitated, meeting each of their eyes, before continuing. "I knew I needed to attack the thing's soul. I only have one attack for that. I stole it, took its soul, and siphoned part of its power. That's why I got its skill and so many levels. Luke kept pausing as he spoke, taking many short breaths in between his words. It sounded to Mash like he was more scared of his own actions, than how any of them would react to it. Mash thought his 5 levels were a lot, but 9 levels from essentially a single enemy was unheard of. He knew that Luke got some levels from the other monsters, but that was still insane. Did that mean that if he kept stealing things' souls, he would have leveled rapidly? Could all liches do that? That question caused Mash to shiver, and he pushed the thought away. Instead, he tried to find some words of comfort too, but realized it would be better to keep his mouth shut. His first thought had been to mention how powerful Luke's skills were, or how the new attack was basically an instant kill on anyone without otherworldly magical defenses. Even with his paltry social awareness, Mash knew that none of those notions would do anything to appease Luke. It would probably just make things worse. Mash turned to Jill, but she seemed just as lost as he was, probably only able to come up with stupid quips. Luke, once we get out of here, you should have Luna heal you. Jill decides to give him some advice, holding back whatever wisecrack she thought of. Though, Mash didn't understand her intentions and prompted her for more. The others seemed just as confused and waited for Jill to explain. She has a healing skill that can help you sort through your thoughts. Well, not exactly like that, it just helps you process things better. Look, I can't explain it the best, but it should help. She told me about it when I was struggling with the stuff Mash talked about before. I didn't accept it, but maybe you should give it a try. Jill explained her reasoning, and Mash agreed that it sounded like a good idea. Honestly, he might go to Luna, even if it didn't do all that much. Despite his items and skills, this place had bothered him significantly. Luke only stared at his hands for a moment, before wiping his face and nodding towards Jill. It wouldn't change the reality but hoped the healing would help Luke process it. Mash tried to change the topic as the silence grew among the group. What about you two? How many levels? They went on to explain how each of them had gained 4 levels themselves, and Mash was still amazed by that. They had done the least in this last battle but had still gained 4 levels. Even if they were a lower level than Mash, it still felt like they had gained a lot from the fight. Why had he gained so many levels and how come he gained them at the same rates as the others? Mash wished there was someone who could answer his questions and realized that there might actually be. The library in the capital should be filled with information on classes and levels, not to mention the princesses would have access to more information too. He hadn't seen the princesses in a few days but figured he would get the chance soon. For now, he crossed his legs and began his meditation. He used the time to adjust to the new range of his mana territory while recovering. It had been surprising to see how low his health had gotten. He hadn't been hit many times, but it was clear that the number of hits didn't correlate to the damage he had taken. Normally, he would ask Red or Luke to help him heal, but they were also recovering. Luke's recovery was more a mental ordeal than a physical one, but Mash didn't want to bother him. His skill should be enough to heal the injuries he had, and he simply let it happen. The pain was subdued compared to the other torture he experienced today, and he could handle it easily. Once Mash had finished his recovery, the group was ready to move on. Their priority was finding a key for the cells and the entrance gate, so they moved towards the monster's corpse. Well, there wasn't really a corpse left, but they went to its tattered clothing anyways. Guessing that there would be a key in its clothing, they debated on who would sort through the bloody rags. Ultimately, Mash ended up doing it. Red and Jill absolutely refused, and he wasn't so callous as to push that onto Luke. Walking up to its clothing, Mash was able to better understand the size of the thing. Its clothing covered a large section of the floor, torn and tattered from the explosion of its physical body. Mash bent over to lift it and realized that it was not a material he knew of. It was heavy, not that he couldn't lift it, but much heavier than cloth would be. Furthermore, it felt strangely metallic, and Mash tried tearing it with all his strength. It didn't even stretch when he put his back behind the effort. The material was an armor of some kind, but Mash didn't feel like collecting it. He didn't even care if it was valuable, he wouldn't wear the thing's clothing in any circumstance. He didn't actually need to look through the armor, merely walking around to let his mana territory encompass it. The clothing was magical in nature, and he figured that the key would be too. If it didn't have mana then it would contrast from the clothing, and if it did then he hoped it was different from the cloth. Either way would let him find it, the only problem would be if the mana of the item matched the cloth, since it might blend then. However, he knew that it would have to be perfectly identical for that to happen. He didn't find it though and started a more meticulous search of the clothing. He didn't want to miss the item if it was there and was disappointed that he couldn't sense it with his skill. It took several minutes to search through all pieces of clothing, but he had found nothing. Before looking over the remains on the battlefield, they decided to check out the room the creature had been in before. The room was elevated slightly, and Mash made a simple ramp that they could climb. Jill could have teleported them, but it was almost always a better idea for Mash to use his energy before anyone else used their mana. They climbed the ramp and entered the now broken glass wall. Thankfully, there were a few chests and large desks in the room. Everything was made for the large creature and took a lot of effort to open and search through. They found a lot of interesting things. One of the chests was filled with extra clothing, and the desks were filled with books and papers. Red made sure to collect the books and papers, and Jill searched through the chest of the clothing. Mash and Luke looked through the other chest and found it filled with parts from numerous types of creatures, the smell burning his nostrils. Mash and Luke stepped backward, slamming the chest shut. Turning towards Jill and Red, they hoped that one of them would find the key. Sadly, they weren't so lucky and had to search through the chest of decaying animal parts. Nobody wanted to search the last chest, so they instead poured it out over the floor, and looked over the scattered pieces quickly. The smell quickly filled the small room but was much more manageable as it dispersed throughout the entire space. It was still bad though, as an alcoholic-smelling liquid poured out along with the decaying pieces. Did the thing drink this stuff? Mash gagged at the thought of it. However, there was no key or any object that would look like one either. This left them needing to meticulously search the entire arena. They began their search, scouring the room carefully. They double-checked when they couldn't find the item on their first scan. They had to pick through the charred remains of creatures as well as the goopy pseudo-flesh that was left by the larger monsters. Everything about the process was disgusting, but they persevered anyway. The key was the only way to save the people. The entire search had taken around 2 hours, and they finally had to decide that there was no key. The creature had a different method for entering the cells and doors. Giving up on searching the room further, they left toward the cells again. They would need to figure out how the creature opened these things, or they would be forced to use the dungeon key and abandon the people in the cells. That was not something any of them wanted to do. Chapter 86, Difficult Decisions. Leaving the room, the first thing they tried to do was figure out the gate that led in and out of the dungeon. This was the biggest concern, since opening the cells wouldn't mean much unless they got the people out. There were no more monsters either. Mash figured the alien thing from before had been making them, and without it, no more monsters would appear. Their numbers were finite as this was not a real dungeon, just something like one. Mash wondered how it worked as they made their way to the entrance. During their walk, more of the humans in the cells decided to look beyond their grates. Mash guessed that his lightning attack had woken and startled most of them. Now some of the humans looked onto them. As people seemed to realize that they were human, they started calling out to them, clearly desperate for salvation. Mash had already been determined to help them, though not out of some heroic ideal. It was a pity that made him want to save these people. Simply considering their situation had left a bad taste in his mouth, and he pitied them. From the stories that Mash could remember, heroes didn't save people for things like pity. They were supposed to save them simply because it was right. Although, as he looked over the trapped people, some now malformed with inhuman transformations, Mash believed that it was the stories that were wrong. He didn't think that anyone could look upon these people without feeling some pity. Their cries echoed slightly around the ground, and Mash knew that they needed some information. "We are going to try and open the gate first. If we can't get it open, then we're all dead." He thought that was good enough for now, and his voice easily carried through the room. He didn't want to let them know that he had a key to get out, since that would only cause more problems. Honestly, Mash wasn't certain who deserved to leave with them, as the key would be open long enough for several people to come with them. Telling them of its existence now could cause needless violence, and Mash already knew that he wouldn't be saving the adults first. However, Mash saw as the faces of the people fell, taking his words in a negative light. The downcast looks got Jill to jab him in the side, but Red and Luke started to move towards the nearest cells. Red similarly yelled loud enough for the people in the cells to hear. "We are healers and will walk around the cells, giving people food and healing what we can." Their words did get a large portion of the crowd to look up, and Mash started hearing people shout for them to go there first. Red and Luke ignored all the words heading to cells with children in them first, completely ignoring the ones with adults. Mash heard some callous remarks when Red or Luke skipped over to a cell with adults to go to the next cell with children. With the two of them busy, Mash followed after Jill, who called back to him. "Well, I guess it is our job to get the gates open. Any bright ideas?" Mash did have an idea and grinned as he made his reply. "Yeah, I have one bright idea." The wordplay was lost on her as she didn't understand what he meant, but he didn't feel the need to explain it. Priscilla knew what he was thinking but didn't laugh. Instead, Mash felt a surprising degree of annoyance at his joke. He shook his head slightly when Jill looked at him with confusion. He didn't want to spoil the surprise. It didn't take long to get to the gate, and Mash prepared his idea. The metal gate was covered in small etchings, probably some kind of enchantment meant to stop passage and Jill's teleportation. The metal was hard, and he doubted that it could be broken, as his many attacks that slammed into the walls and floors did nothing to even dent them. He had only managed to break the glass yet and doubted the gate would be a different situation. However, he had noticed something else with his lightning. It was a simple plan, but he formed a few versions of Priscilla, growing them out large enough to be able to bite one of the grates. He directed them to grab onto a section of the gates, and he sat down to start using his lightning magic. Knowing his plan, Priscilla already outlined the pathways for the lightning. A grin sprouted on his face, as he started pouring lightning into the imitations, using them to funnel its output into the gates directly. He had managed to melt the floors and walls with his previous attack and hoped that he could do it again. He used as much energy as he could, feeling for the first time the limits of his stats. There was only so much he could force out of his body at a time, and even with persist he couldn't pour out an unlimited amount of power all the time. Stats had rarely been a limitation for him, especially since intelligence was one of his highest attributes. Priscilla's outline was clearly able to hold more energy, and he continued to fill it as much as he could. The sound of thunder grew louder, and the wood itself started shaking from the passage of lightning within. He continued to pour more energy into the technique, even after persist kicked in and didn't let up in the slightest. The power of the lightning was already equivalent to the attack from before, but the bars didn't show any sign of melting, but it was clear that it was heating up. The light from his technique had already begun making it hard to see the effect his attack was having, but he could feel his mana clashing with the gates within his mana territory. He simply needed to put more power into it. However, he couldn't, as the wooden creations broke, some near the apex and others much closer to Mash himself. The lightning branched out, hitting everything nearby, and several strands struck him. Searing pain exploded along where the lightning hit, and he quickly fell unconscious from the after effects of persist. "Woke up, sleepyhead? Been out of it for over an hour." Jill spoke, sounding tired, and Mash could even see Red and Luke recovering their mana. Apparently, he had used a lot of energy even after the skill started, and without Red or Luke's healing, he was stuck in an unconsciousness state for a while. Mash asked the others about the situation of the people within the cells and was astonished at the number of humans that had been captured by the thing. How long had this dungeon been here? From what Luke and Red counted, there were almost 200 living humans, and almost double that in monstrous abominations. Most of them had been here for a long time too and were travelers who were taken either when they arrived or were trying to leave the city. Not wanting to think about that situation, Mash looked at the undamaged gate, but he could have sworn that it almost worked. "You were close, but the wood was not able to handle the lightning at that level." Priscilla had explained why the previous attempt had failed. Mash nodded along, though he probably should have replied aloud since his friends were looking at him with some confusion. Rather than explain, he decided to reply to Priscilla out loud. "Priscilla, what if I just channel the lightning through my hands?" The others looked at him, understanding that he was talking to Priscilla, but they didn't know the rest of the conversation. He wondered a little bit how it must be to only hear half of the conversation. Though he was not going to start repeating everything Priscilla said, and just moved on, focusing on Priscilla's response. "It is too dangerous. You are not skilled enough or strong enough to resist the rebound from the lightning. You would likely damage your mind and body. And before you ask, I will not help you with it, unless you force me to." She was back to her more formal tone, most likely adapting to the seriousness of the situation and his mood. He could only grunt in response because he didn't want to force her to do anything. Their relationship now involved working together, rather than him simply commanding her. She would give advice and suggestions, and he would ask her to do things. She normally never refused, so this situation must be seriously dangerous. It probably bordered on suicide. He did not explain Priscilla's answer yet, trying to come up with solutions instead. "What have you guys tried?" Mash asked the others as they were still recovering, and he guessed that wasn't just from healing people. Nothing has worked, Jill's magic did nothing, and even Luke's new skill doesn't seem to work. My skills were obviously unable to accomplish much other than making a bloody mess. Mash could hear the tension in Red's voice, despite her best attempts at hiding it. They were already past the point of being able to save everyone. Soon they would have to choose who to save. It was not a discussion he was looking forward to, nor did anyone else. Not even one of them broached the topic, instead of trying to figure out other options. They spent several long minutes hitting dead ends, trying various things from using all their magics at once to brute forcing their way through with raw force. They moved on to discuss the option of getting some people out and trying to get help from the outside. Luke was the first to broach the topic, and Mash held his breath as he heard his suggestion. I think we should get as many kids out as possible even if it means staying behind. Hopefully, the people out there can find a way through. Mash could hear the hesitation in Luke's voice, and the consternation on the others' faces. None of them wanted to do it, but to them, it felt like the right thing to do. Mash didn't agree though and forced out his protest. No. It was all Mash said, he didn't have a good justification for it, and didn't bother explaining himself. It was selfishness, and he knew it, but he wasn't prepared or willing to die yet. Luke must have resolved himself to save the children, but Mash would not be able to do the same. The silence grew long as no one spoke. Mash could feel his shoulders tense, ready to receive an accusation from his friends, but nothing came. Let's try to figure something else out, the creature must have had a way to open and close the thing. Plus, we don't even know if the key would work. It should function like Jill's magic and she can't teleport through. Red seemed to want to postpone the decision further, but Mash knew that all she was doing was delaying the decision. She might be right and the monster might have had a method to open and close the gate, but it was dead now, and they couldn't figure out what to do. That wasn't the reason he was so against the idea though. Even if the key worked, he didn't think that people would be able to get through from the other side. From his knowledge, this was another world, and the gate was in an entirely different space. Nobody would be able to do anything from the outside. He felt like his brother would have already busted them out if it was possible. It was a difference in magic and understanding, one that could not be bridged by hope. With their skill sets, they needed to overpower the gate, or somehow gain a skill to get around it. Still, he guessed it was right to try the key. They talked about it a bit more, before deciding to try the key. Then it hit Mash, a chance to get out flashed into his mind. If they could get Jill to her next class, she might gain a true teleportation skill or be able to overpower the gate's defense. However, a quick series of questions told him that wouldn't be a possibility. Even if she had gained levels rapidly within this dungeon, she was only level 49, and gaining 11 levels from the remaining monsters was not possible. He could probably level though, and the advancement might be able to give him enough power to break the gate. I could probably gain another level if I kill some of the remaining monsters. It might be enough to let me break the gates. Mash spoke sadly, knowing that his idea was not something a hero would ever come up with. What monsters? We didn't see any. Red sounded genuinely confused, but it looked like Luke had caught on as he just stared at Mash with widened eyes. Mash couldn't tell if it was horror or shock on his face, but he turned away from his eyes reflexively. Jill put her hand on Mash's shoulder, in what looked to be a comforting and restricting gesture. She clearly didn't know what she thought of Mash's plan but understood why he wanted to try it. Red still seemed lost, and Mash gave her the answer. You told me yourself, there were almost 400 of them. Chapter 87, Blessings and New Classes. Red stared at Mash, her eyebrows raised as far as they could go, but she did not argue. She probably figured that it was the most feasible solution as well, even if it did involve a heartless task. Mash didn't want to try and come up with a method of choosing and only thought of 2 ways to make this bearable. Luke, can you communicate with their souls, or at least bless them or something? Luke was a priest now and had a skill that was like a blessing, so he hoped that he could do something for the people. Luke lifted his downcast gaze, to meet Mash's own before responding. Honestly, I don't know. I've been so afraid of using soul skills, that I haven't tested anything like that. But I will try. Mash only nodded, before rising to his feet. Before even attempting this though, they decided to use the key. Ultimately Mash would remain behind, and after some very strong insistence from Luke, it was decided that he would remain too. Jill and Red would be enough to get out and get help, while Mash was the only one who was close enough to a power-up to remain. Luke was too, though Mash didn't think that Luke could go through with it. It had been a part of his argument though, and Mash knew he was telling the truth. If he was willing to steal souls, then he could reach his next advancement fairly quickly. They stood in front of some of the children's cells going over the plan once more before using the key. It was unnecessary, there was no chance anyone would forget. Red and Jill would leave with as many children as possible, and Mash and Luke would wait for 2 days before attempting to break out. They had decided upon that time limit, for 2 reasons. In all their searching they had found no sources of food or water other than the monster corpses, but that was not something they would do. The other reason was that several of the prisoners looked like they were malnourished and ill. With that in mind, Luke and Mash would wait 2 days before trying to power their way through. Finally, Red tried activating the key. It started to light up as though it would work, but the lights faded soon after. They could only stare at the obvious failure of the key. Stunned by the failure, they stared at the key for several minutes trying many different things to get it working. Nothing happened, but they didn't panic immediately. They still had the other plan but could wait a bit longer before starting. However, they wouldn't wait the full 2 days though, instead just for a couple of hours. The main reason for this difference was time dilation. Honestly, they had entered the dungeon without knowing if time flowed normally in here, and the big issue with this topic was the fact that they might have already been in here for months. The people outside might assume that their entire group had died. What if the dungeon entrance had closed, or got connected to a different place? That was something that usually happened once a day, and they were worried already. Thankfully, they had entered the dungeon, and should still have some time left. There were too many problems with waiting too long. None of that was the biggest concern for Mash though. He was worried about how his family would deal with his disappearance or death. As selfish as it might be, he had only conceded to the previous plan on the assumption that Jill and Red could inform his siblings of the situation. Now that they couldn't, his priority became getting out. He would still try and save as many people as he could, but he had things that were more important to him. Even these few hours felt like they were too long. Eventually, he couldn't sit still any longer and rose to his feet, unable to shake the image of his siblings standing at his funeral. He would first check every mutated person with his mana territory and determine who was the strongest. Hopefully, that would lessen the number of people whom he would need to kill. While he walked by all the cells and determined the strongest of the changed people, Luke and Jill went from cell to cell trying to bless or communicate with people's souls. Mash's journey across the rooms had not lessened his resolve but strengthened it as he saw the horrible state of all the people, not just the ones who were mutated. None of the people were all that powerful, most seemed to be weaker than himself. Not to mention most looked like traders or merchants and guessed that all the fighters that were taken had become the monsters he fought earlier. He grew despondent, thinking about how many people he would need to kill in order to gain the level. His shoulders fell and he found it harder to meet the people's eyes and relied on his mana territory to observe them. As he finished his trek around the room, he returned to where the others were sitting. He slowed down as he started to hear muffled sobs. Luke had tears streaking down his face but was clenching his fists hard enough that Mash started catching a glimpse of blood. Luke had been told to try and communicate with the turned people, and Mash was scared to ask him what had happened. Would he still be able to go through with the plan if Luke opposed it now? What happened? Mash still forced the question out, knowing that he couldn't kill anyone without asking the question. They weren't there anymore. Their souls and minds were so twisted that they had become ruined, empty husks of pain and suffering. None of the people had anything but pain. Mash, I don't think they would even recognize that you killed them and might even be grateful for it if they could. Luke's words probably should have relieved Mash, but they didn't. They only made Mash feel worse for the people, and even if ending their lives was a type of salvation for them, it wasn't one he wanted to deliver. However, Mash could not go back on his plan, it was one of the only methods to save everyone, and he would do what must be done. Mash went to the cell of the strongest person he sensed, approaching the metal bars slowly. Inside of the cell, the turned human just sat in one of the corners unmoving. Mash saw what looked like scales and an extra eye on the person's face. His body was completely contorted, his legs and arms looked like they were attached randomly, and it was clear the person would never be able to move. There was another in the cell, a young woman whose eyes lit up upon him approaching the cell. Mash guessed she assumed that he was there to save her, but instead he asked her for something else. Do you know that person's name? Mash didn't need to explain who he was talking about, his eyes were focused on the transformed human. Mash wasn't sure if the girl would answer him as he was not wearing his mask, and he might have frightened her. I think she was called Julia. She didn't sound at all frightened, if anything she seemed glad to have someone speak to her. Mash nodded his head, but never took his eyes off Julia. He hadn't even been able to tell that she was a girl, the transformations had transformed her too much. The other girl, the one who had spoken, moved away from him as his wooden blades snuck into the cell like snakes. Once inside they grew large enough to kill Julia in one strike, and he brought the blade down like an executioner. This had finally gotten the other to feel fear, and she backed away from him and the wooden creations, silently sitting on the ground. Mash gave both of them an apology, before moving on to the next monster. This process continued until he had killed 31 people, and he made sure to get the names of every person he could. Although he could only get the names of 20 people, the others had been turned long before their cellmates had arrived. Mash didn't know if he could remember their names but still felt that he wanted to know them. At least now, they hadn't died as nameless monsters, and instead as human beings. However, Mash had received his level up, and he would not let their lives be lost in vain. He felt his consciousness get whisked away to the familiar place where he would select his class but did not feel the same joy he did last time. The melancholy he felt seemed to permeate the space, and it was far darker than he remembered. Even the pillars of light before him seemed subdued. Mash was surprised to see them though, as they all shone with the same colors. A very dark green that it seemed almost black, was mixed with an equally dark blue, the colors clashing with one another as the power seemed to be moving upwards. He didn't hesitate this time, reaching for the closest pillar first. It didn't seem like he would be getting a wide variety of classes this time. Starved Thunderwood Dragonling, your hunger knows no bounds, devouring anything your teeth can crunch into. Furthermore, you have eaten those which dragons eat and flown in their skies in admiration of the beings. As a being of life and destruction, of wood and thunder, you attempt to become more than human and join the ranks of dragons. Mash stared at the class for a second, processing what it would mean. The part related to hunger would likely improve his eating skill, and while useful wasn't what he needed right now. However, the other two parts seemed like they would help significantly. Even a fraction of a dragon's true power should be enough to destroy the gate, and the part related to his elemental control would probably boost his power as well. All things considered, the class would probably give him enough power to break through the gate. That fact alone almost made him choose it without checking the others, but he stopped himself. There was one concerning aspect about the class, and it caused him to hope for more in the other two. A dragonling sounded like something fundamentally beneath a real dragon, and that was not what he wanted. He wanted to usurp their power and surpass them, not become a baby version of them. With his mind set, he moved towards the next pillar. Draconic Thunderwood Imitation, like the mimics of old, you imitate the form and power of creatures far beyond you. Even dragons are but a mere imitation and are not enough to satisfy you. Your wood has been strengthened by the power of lightning, through your unnatural access of different magics. Hiding behind your human appearance, you consume the power of beings greater than yourself. You will not be bound by a single creature and instead, hope to steal all that you can. This sounded far more like what he was looking for. It was still dragon-related somehow, though he didn't know exactly how. Not to mention he could imitate other creatures as well. Instantly images of the greater beings flashed through his mind. Even a minor imitation of either creature would easily be enough power to smash the gate. Still, he hesitated though, a portion of the description frightening him. Looking over the class again, he realized that it was more than just a small portion that alarmed him. It sounded like the whole class was power-hungry, and he now knew that his class choice could impact his mind. Would taking this class to alter his mind, turn him into a power-crazed monstrosity? That question caused him to move on to the next class. It's not that the class wasn't enticing, he just didn't want to become like that. Although it was clear that it would be a power-up and sounded like it would give him more in the long run. Still, he reached for the last pillar. Only when he got close did he realize it was darker than the other two, though from a distance they would all look black. Monstrous Thunderwood Executioner, you have killed those that were too weak and helpless to defend themselves from your power. Even those far beneath you can increase your power, and you will walk any path available. Embracing your monstrous side allows you to gain power in ways others could not. Devastate enemies with the elements, kill hordes with your thunder, gaining power from each death no matter how small. Mash felt anger rise as he read the class, instantly realizing the implication of a class like this. It clearly implied that it would remove the restrictions on leveling from low-leveled monsters, and probably people too. This class explained some things to him and made him further dislike the system. Mash had believed that it encouraged people to fight stronger monsters and people and protect the weaker beings. However, it seemed like killing weaker opponents could give someone a class related to killing them. Was that how the villains in history were created? Did they just have a class that gave them a lot of power for killing weak people? Shivering slightly, he dismissed the class from his mind. It would be a constant reminder of his actions here, and he didn't need anything else than his memories to haunt him. They might fade eventually, but his class would not, and he rejected the class summarily. That was not what he would select and contemplated all the classes he was offered. He wished that Priscilla was there, as she would be able to help him understand what the classes might do. Honestly, he expected her to be there and hoped to be able to communicate. Although, he wasn't so lucky and talked to himself in the emptiness as he thought of the options. The last class would not be chosen, that much was obvious, and he discarded the class. The other two were much more interesting and were also very similar. Both related to dragons somehow, even mentioning the creatures directly. The first took him down the path of dragons, but also seemed beneath them. The second involved clashing with the beings but seemed much more focused on power. Either would probably affect his mind in some way, and he spent several minutes contemplating the choices. He began to wonder what his friends were seeing and decided he should probably make his decision soon. Letting out a sigh, he realized he came to his decision. The Dragonling class was powerful, and becoming a dragon sounded incredible, but it also sounded restricting. His current path was free, and he could become anything through his copies. Narrowing his path because of his admiration of the creatures was not the right choice and he knew it. He wanted to be more than just a dragon, and it sounded like the other class would give him that opportunity. Finally, he moved and touched the pillar representing the Draconic Thunderwood imitation and woke up to darkness. Chapter 88, Transformations. Mash opened his eyes and saw nothing. Darkness without even the faintest hint of light surrounded him. His first inclination was to assume that the room had darkened for some reason, but Priscilla's message had given him the real answer. Your magic formed an egg around you when the class advancement started. That explained the darkness, but Mash had to consider how large the egg was. Even with his arms outstretched, he reached no wall, and only when he attempted to stand did he feel the slant of the floor. It was larger than even the range of his mana territory, which he guessed might be different now. Mash worried about what his appearance would look like now, especially considering the situation. However, a bigger concern ran through his mind, and he immediately checked his stats, ignoring the darkness and the faint calls of his friends from the outside. Name, Mash Stellumbra Class, Draconic Thunderwood Imitation. Level, 60. Health, 589/1400. Energy, 23/2150. Fortitude, 140/160. Endurance, 85/100. Strength, 87/107. Agility, 90/110. Intelligence, 130/140. Wisdom, 73/83. Charisma, 65/75. Free stats, 0. Skills, Persist to Hunt, Monowood Creation to Thunderwood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Monstrous Transformation, Thunderwood Imitation, Mana Territory to Draconic Domain, Unnatural Monster Core to Adaptable Monster Core, Inhumanity to Monstrous Humanity, Wooden Body, Carnivorous Tree to Mimic's Avarice. Persist to Hunt, you have gone beyond your limits when fighting enemies and devouring their power. Go beyond your limits. Continue current fight even after depleting energy. Stats improve while at 0 stamina. Continues until either you or your enemies are dead. Current bonus, plus 100% stats. Inhuman Hibernation, you have stolen the techniques of mages and monks to form an artificial technique, your inhuman body morphing it to fit your corrupted nature. Hibernating will increase the rate at which your body recovers, healing most wounds. Current rate, plus 200% recovery. Monowood Creation to Thunderwood Creation, you know how deadly sticks can be. Forge your mana into wooden creations. Lightning has tempered your wood, and it thrums with the power of thunder. Wooden Body, you can connect with the wood that you are touching. By expending your energy, you bring your creations to life as another one of your limbs. Monstrous Transformation, transform your body taking on aspects of those which you have consumed. Thunderwood Imitation, form imitations of creatures you have consumed, imitating some of their bodily functions through your wood. Mana Territory to Draconic Domain, passive your eyes just weren't enough. Sense the changes in the mana around you. Connect to the mana in your space and inherently understand the nature of the mana. Your presence suffuses the space, weakens the magic of enemies beneath you. Current range, 15 feet. Unnatural monster core to adaptable monster core. Passive and unnatural mana core has fundamentally altered your body, fusion with a monster has given you access to its potential. Stamina and mana combine to become energy. Your monstrous body is better able to handle the changes to your core. Current bonus, plus 35% to 50% efficiency. Inhumanity to monstrous humanity, passive giving up your humanity has improved your body, improving your physical control, natural defenses, animalistic intuition, and mana control. Now, a human in appearance only, you further empower yourself through your monstrous side. Carnivorous tree to mimics avarice, passive devour your enemy in battle to temporarily raise your stats. The fresher the victim, the stronger the bonus. Gain full benefits even when consuming through your magic. Absorbs some properties of those you devour alive. Removes the negative effects of things you consume. Mash was certain he would look like a freak now and felt like one too. Honestly, his body no longer felt human, and the more he focused on it the stranger it felt. There was this strange lack of delay in his movements and perception, probably from the improved inhumanity skill. And even within total darkness, he could tell that his movements came more automatically. He had to think about each action less, his body seeming to move according to his thoughts. He was surprised he only gained 2 skills but was shocked by how many of his skills had evolved. From what his brother had told him, a person could gain anywhere from 1 to 5 skills from this advancement, and Mash was a bit disappointed to see only 2. That vanished as he saw his stat improvements though. The stat improvement might have caused his improved physical ability. Honestly, he expected a small boost all around, which seemed to be the norm for advancing a class, but he received massive boosts to all the stats related to his body. His brother had told him to expect around 50 total stats but he gained around double that. His strength, dexterity, endurance and fortitude had gone up significantly. Even his mental stats had improved, even if the degree was smaller. However, seeing his improvements, he realized that he was probably stronger than this rank when his persist skill was active before. Although, that would really depend on the efficacy of his skills. That was one of the things that worried him. His persist skill had changed, becoming more tailored to how he had used it thus far. He was worried that it wouldn't work when trying to deal with the gate anymore. Although he might not need it, especially considering the full extent of his monstrous transformation skill. He didn't know what aspects the skill mentioned, but if it involved proficiency, he could imitate Priscilla's lightning affinity. Also, there was the piece of dragon flesh he consumed and was certain that anything he gained from that would make him a lot stronger. Excited by the prospects of testing his skills, he moved towards the edge of the egg. It was made of his wood, and as he touched it, it felt like it was vibrating a little. He was about to punch it open but realized that he was missing his clothes. He hadn't worn his mending clothes, instead of relying on wooden armor to cover his body. Although, the armor was gone now, probably used to make the shell. Before punching through the shell, he brought out his mending clothes, finding it surprisingly easy to put the clothes on. His Draconic domain made it so he could see the clothing easily. After he was fully clothed, he decided to break the shell. He could see his friends pacing and talking outside since they were standing within his range now. It looked like they were debating whether they should break the egg or not. Not wanting to keep them waiting, he broke the shell. He was excited to see their reactions and see what the changes would be like for him. Mash tried breaking the wood with a punch, imagining it would be more like the egg hatching, but his fist only made a thud against the shell. Even with his improved strength, the wood was undamaged, making him realize how much stronger his wood had become. Now, he knew what the skill meant by stating that it was tempered by lightning. Wondering if he could break the gate without even using lightning, he chose to control the wood to open instead of trying to break it. It opened as a door would, and he stepped out. "Hey guys, how's it going?" His friends stared at him, mouth stuck open. They didn't say a single word, and Mash turned toward the metal wall, using the metal to see a reflection of his entire body. His clothes blocked most of his body, but he could see his neck, hands, and face in the reflection. Instantly, he realized what had stunned them. He looked human now. His eyes were still different, but his body lacked the markings and scales that had crisscrossed his skin before. Even, the mana scar that had crawled down his neck had vanished, leaving only his tattoos to blemish his rather pristine skin. Any scars or injuries were also gone. His tattoos were now completely visible, the necklace was no longer hidden with the other markings. Small black lines rolled around his neck as if someone had cut him hundreds of times. Beneath his ears, the flower tattoos were much more noticeable as there was nothing else to distract people from them. His eyes remained though, and Mash wondered if they were the result of the marks rather than his class, or was it a combination of both. His next inclination was to remove his shirt and check the marking on the rest of his body. However, what he saw made him feel inhuman. He had become leaner, so much so that it was unnatural. His muscles were detailed in a way that would be impossible for human beings. They were closer to what someone might find on a snake. The sight caused him to shiver, reminding him of the warden's imitation of a human body. Had his class turned him into something like that? There were a lot of transformations involved in the class, and he didn't consider that it might make him like that monster. Almost as a reaction, he tried using his monstrous transformation skill to make him more human-looking. Surprisingly, it worked, but he felt a constant drain on his energy as he kept the transformation active. He knew he couldn't do that and returned to partially human form. It wasn't that the form was hideous like the previous monster. Honestly, it might even be considered more attractive to some, but he didn't like how it reminded him of that thing from before. Unconsciously, he realized that he could transform into that thing too, but stopped himself. He did want to test the skill more and imagined becoming more like Priscilla. Scales grew all over his body, covering him entirely in dark blue and green scales, that seemed almost black. They matched the color of the pillars from earlier, and he felt Priscilla's jubilation. "Your body feels much more like mine now. I can feel the difference in your affinities and mana control. You should let me control it now." Distracted by the changes, Mash didn't answer her. He felt physically stronger, but not by much. However, it felt like his mind had grown several times more powerful. He took in his surrounding quickly, absorbing the information automatically. Not to mention he found it easier to split his focus among different aspects of his body. He felt like he could replicate any magic if he saw it now and truly understood how much mana control Priscilla had. However, even she could not replicate any magic she wanted and realized it must be harder than it seemed. Still, he felt significantly more powerful. Now, to test a draconic transformation. What in the world do you think you're doing? Care to say anything? Jill and Red spoke simultaneously, both seeming to want some answer from Mash. From the excitement of the changes and exploring his skill, Mash had forgotten about the surroundings. He had even forgotten about the situation, and the changes to his persist skill. Now though, those thoughts came back to him, and he was worried about whether he could break through the gate. The more he thought about the changes to the skill, the less certain he was on it. Was the change a benefit? Sure, it sounded like it would allow him to not have to continuously do an action for the effect, and it would be active so long as he was fighting. That would make him a lot stronger and more versatile in a fight, but he had partially overcome that weakness already. Now, it sounded like his skill would no longer work for training or forming creations outside of combat. He knew that skills could become narrower, but it still bothered him. Would the other class have changed the skill too? It was too late for regrets now, and he told his friends of what he gained while returning to his normal form. The explanation took a while, as he didn't fully understand his skills either. He tested some a little bit, forming a wooden imitation of Priscilla to see what Thunderwood imitation did. Mash was surprised to see the results. He could see through the eyes of the creation, and it felt much more alive now. It was covered in scales that matched the real Priscilla too, making it almost indistinguishable from her body. He had asked her if it was one of her bodies, even though he could tell that it was not. Since it felt so alive, Mash disconnected himself from the creation and realized he still felt a connection to it. Able to move it as though it were connected to him. Priscilla explained how that it was the same when she controlled her extra bodies and explained that it must have some form of a mind. In response to her explanation, he gave the small creation a command to circle him, and it did so. It expended a small amount of energy to maintain the connection, but it still astounded him. "You are literally a one-man army now, aren't you?" Luke spoke as he watched the wooden clone of Priscilla circle him. Nodding his head in agreement, Mash pictured himself creating hundreds of replicas of Priscilla and sending them to thrash about in a fight. How powerful did people get? He knew that not many people got beyond level 100, but even with his power he felt like he could be a serious threat to a kingdom. Just how powerful was the kingdom? Mash could only shake his head as he thought of the known powerhouses of the world. Mash had a lot of questions he wanted answers for and thought about the adventurers who had sponsored them. Perhaps they would be willing to answer some of his questions, but first, he needed to get out of here. Excitedly he got up, ready to test his new power on the gate, and finally try out the Draconic transformation. Chapter 89, Draconic Superiority. Mash stood close to the gate. It reminded him of the barred cell doors of the prison, thin bars no bigger than his palm making the entirety of the gate. Each was engraved with intricate runes, and previously none of them had managed to do anything to the metal. It would be a different situation now. Mash had access to power unlike what he could have managed before. He decided to use his transformation skill again, however this time he embraced that small bit of dragon flesh that he had consumed. The transformation into Priscilla had strengthened him significantly, and he knew that Priscilla was not as powerful as a dragon. Even the smallest dragon would be far stronger than she was, and he was eager to embrace its power. The transformation took longer now than it had earlier, his boots breaking from the growth of his feet. Mash had gotten used to wearing his wood as shoes, but they did nothing in resisting the claws that grew from his feet. His hands had also grown long claws, and scales formed all over his body as they had earlier. They were different now though, a deep shade of black rather than dark shades of another color. They were also significantly thicker, and he guessed that his body weight would have more than doubled from the scales alone. He even noticed other changes as his tongue grew longer and collided with now sharpened teeth. While he had transformed to be more like Priscilla, he had felt huge changes to his magic control and comprehension. This was different, and his body felt significantly stronger. He didn't feel much change to his magical control or comprehension, but he did feel like he could output more raw power. It seemed like his dragon form had improved him in terms of raw power, and nothing else. He felt stronger, faster, and even more confident. It was as if this form was making him feel powerful. After all, what could resist the power of a dragon? Mash shook his head dismissing the thought, realizing that either his earrings or Priscilla were helping him keep his thoughts grounded. Were all dragons arrogant? Could arrogance even be a physical condition? Those were questions for later, as it seemed like many were. His list of questions without answers had seemed to only grow and hoped that the library would have some answers for him. If not, Ivorin seemed rather talkative the last time they spoke. Thinking about it, he believed that the elf would be more than a little excited to act the knowledgeable adventurer. The thoughts distracted Mash as he reached his hand out towards the gate. Originally, Mash had planned on using his wooden creations or lightning to try and overpower the gate, but he felt like that was unnecessary. He could just overpower the gate, it was just a simple cage. Gripping the bar he closed his hand tightly, pulling it towards him. His arm seemed to thicken as he did this, the scales grinding against the metal. It looked like his arm was inflating as he pulled with impossible strength, that he figured would surpass someone whose class was dedicated to it. His arm began shaking from the exertion, and the gate seemed to shake as he expended his energy. The sound of growling escaped from his throat, and his teeth grated against one another as his eyes narrowed from the strain. Rather than forming his energy into lightning or wood, he just used it like a bludgeon smashing his energy against the mana inside the gate. Essentially, he was just bashing the mana in the gate till it broke. Eventually, it did just that, and the bar he was holding bent as he pried it away from the rest of the gate. The single bar being ripped off seemed to be enough, as the rest of the gate seemed to lose all its magical properties. The magical enchantments on the metal had been destroyed, and the rest of the metal was ripped off like paper. Name: Mash Stell Lumber Class, Draconic Thunderwood Imitation. Level: 60. Health: 2800/1600. Energy: 978/2400. Fortitude: 160. Endurance: 100. Strength: 107. Agility: 110. Intelligence: 140. Wisdom: 83. Charisma: 75. Free stats: 5. Before returning to his human form, Mash checked his stats curious to see if the system would show the changes. It had not been shown him the changes to his stats but had shown him something else of interest. Two things stood out to him in fact. His health had gone up by 800 points, implying that he was much more durable while in that state. That made sense, but he was surprised to see it shown as being above his maximum. The other thing that had surprised him was the energy drain. He was able to watch as it continuously ticked down and knew that within a few minutes he would be out of energy. Rushing back into his human form, he realized now what that transformation really did for him. He figured the physical improvements might even be better than his persist skill had been, but the energy drain was immense. Using that form outside of a fight was incredibly impractical. However, the power spoke for itself as they saw the remains of the gate. He had pried something open that he couldn't even manage to damage with double his previous stats. Mash knew that it was not just physical power that let him do that, as the gate had become a lot weaker when he used his energy to break the enchantments, but it was still an impressive display. That much was obvious from the expression on his friends' faces. Mash was a little surprised to see that they had taken a few steps away from him but was grinning as they gaped at him like fishes. Mash saw that glint of jealousy in their eyes, and he couldn't blame them. Even he was excited to see what their advancements would be. Mash knew that 100 and 200 advancements were considered the biggest, and he couldn't imagine what his next advancement would do for him. Would he be able to become a real dragon? Thinking about that though, he doubted it. That would be far too powerful, though he couldn't see what else the next advancement could do for him. Well, that was terrifying. Luke's words cut Mash out of his thoughts, and he turned towards him. He thought about what he had done, and while it might be scary, it didn't warrant the looks he was getting. What was? Clearly missing the point, Mash asked him to elaborate. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like something pressed down on us. It was like your... Luke trailed off, seemingly unable to find the right words. Presence. Mash had an idea of what he meant and offered his suggestion. Luke only shook his head though, letting Mash know that he was wrong. No, it was more physical than that. Like staring down an enormous being and knowing that it wouldn't even notice your existence. So more like your girth. Despite Jill sprouting a grin as she finished her statement, Mash felt little amusement in her words. He did wonder what it must feel like though and considered how weaker monsters would react if even his friends felt frightened. Well, Mash, time to go smash some cells. Rolling his eyes, he moved towards the first cell. Originally, Jill might have been needed to get people out, but they knew it would be faster for Mash to do it. It looked like he would be testing to see if his hunt skill would still function like persist. As he approached the first cell, the people inside moved to the back, knowing that he was going to destroy the cell. Mash guessed that several people had seen his display with the ceiling gate and were being very wary of him now. Turning into his dragon form, he gripped two of the cell bars with his hands. His arms bulked up like before, and he felt his energy pour into the cell bars. They took a lot less power to pry apart, and Mash started moving from cell to cell. He was a lot faster now and managed to break almost 50 cell doors before collapsing. Disappointingly, his hunt skill hadn't activated, and he knew that it would not be as versatile as persist. The skill had become narrower, and while it would make him stronger in real combat, it was weaker in other situations. However, he didn't pass out, and only slumped down against the wall. The metal felt cool against his back as he returned to his human-like form. He didn't think of his normal form as being human, as his body seemed impossible for normal humans to achieve. It was unnatural like the beautiful auction people but in a very different direction. At least, it was less horrific than his old form. He started using inhuman hibernation, recovering his energy so that he could continue. Jill had started getting people too, as they realized it would take a while if they left it solely to Mash. Mash's meditation was interrupted, as a girl approached him. Mash recognized her as the girl who was in the cell with Julia, the first of the transformed that he had killed. She had been terrified of him after she realized what he was doing. Not knowing how to react, Mash only stared at her awkwardly as she approached. When she got close, she gave him a small smile, before speaking. "Thank you." That was all she said. That singular action had been like a light that he desperately needed, and he looked towards. Before, he had ignored her, but now it was different. She looked to be several years older him but had a youthful face. Long red-brown hair poured down her face in an unkempt way. She had tried to tuck it behind her ears, but it wasn't working and constantly fell over her face. Even though her cheeks were sullen from starvation, it was clear that she was beautiful, and Mash couldn't help but be grateful to her. Those two words had been something he needed, even if he didn't know it. "Wait, what's your name?" "It's Ashley." She only turned slightly to give him her name but never stopped walking towards the gate. The trapped people had been congregating there, waiting for Mash and his friends to finish. They probably wanted them to escort the group out, and Mash understood why. They were probably scared to leave on their own, unsure of what could be waiting for them on the other side. Once he finished recovering his energy, he continued freeing people. Even with his dragon form active, several people had mustered the courage to thank him, and each one broke down the terror from before. By the time he finished freeing everyone, Mash was feeling a lot better. Not ready to return to the group though, Mash started recovering his energy again. Breaking the rest of the cells open had drained him. It didn't take long to recover, only a few minutes, and he returned to the others. They were already ready to go but had waited for Mash anyways. Stepping through the dungeon entrance, Mash was a bit surprised at what he saw. His brother was alone, sitting in front of the entrance with his weapon drawn. The blade was in the ground, while he sat atop a throne of ice. Looking around, Mash realized that the building was destroyed. The image his brother cut was striking. A man riddled with small injuries, sitting upon a throne of ice, surrounded by a frozen world. Mash didn't understand what was happening. The air was thick frost, and each of his breaths was visible. Even without his mana sense, Mash could tell that his brother had advanced his class as well. The power that radiated off his brother was unfathomable, and his mana seemed endless to Mash. The blade he was carrying seemed much more complete now, viscous-looking spikes creating teeth along the side of the blade. Instantly Mash noticed the problem: it would be far too cold for the prisoners, and they would probably be hurt from the temperature. Mash was pretty sure the only reason he was fine was his new constitution. Arthur turned his head up to meet Mash, and two pairs of inhuman eyes met one another. His brother's eyes were very different now, and they had become a shining coin of silver and blue. Reminding Mash of a gemstone trapped within a silver coin, the gaze had frozen Mash in place. The feeling passed as his brother rose and grabbed Mash in a hug, leaving the sword stuck in the ground behind him. The gesture startled Mash, but he didn't hesitate in reciprocating it. They just stood like that for a few seconds, ignoring everything around them. Chapter 90, Changes. Returning from the dungeon entrance had been a small ordeal, but it felt like a drop of what weighed on Mash's mind. So much had happened in the dungeon, and he had only been given the time to process it now. That too, mainly because his brother was handling most of the cleanup. Mash had been given the opportunity to head home, and he chose to meditate instead of sleeping or talking with anyone. He didn't use his skill, wanting to keep the emotions he felt and process them. Everyone seemed more than happy to have some time to themselves. More thoughts flooded his mind as he remembered what his brother had told him. He had found the kids but had been facing far stronger monsters than Mash had. His brother said he had needed to upgrade his class but remained outside the entrance as he still needed to control his new power. That was the other reason Arthur chose to remain outside, as his power would have been too overwhelming to return home. Someone like Luna would struggle to deal with the cold aura that radiated from his brother. Even his friends had struggled with it, and they only faced it for a few minutes. Mash wanted to stay in his room for another couple of hours, but he needed to visit the guild. There were two things that he was required to do now, and one of those was to update his status at the guild. They were supposed to give him access to new information and missions, and he would also need to update his tournament position. Before, he was slated for the lower rank tournament, but now he would be moved to the bronze rank 1. He wasn't worried, confident that his dragon form far superseded his rank. He would probably spar with his brother later, trying to figure out where he stood. Not to mention, he was curious to see what his brother's new power would be like. Mash had been forcing himself to look at his skills and abilities, thinking about things other than what racked his brain. However, he didn't have the energy to deal with that yet and needed something to distract him. Deciding it was as good a time as any, Mash got out of bed. The guild would be open now, and so would the library. Each was a place he wanted to visit, so he quickly got himself dressed. He threw on his mending clothing and thought about changing the design since he no longer had the mana scars or scales but decided against it. He didn't have that spark of creativity that he had before and decided to ignore it for now. His new appearance did cause him to leave his mask in his storage. He didn't need it anymore, as currently, only his eyes looked inhuman. His body would too if he walked around shirtless, but that wasn't something he was planning on doing anytime soon. Before, he had slowly grown more accepting of walking around with his scales, and now it seemed pointless to hide his eyes. Sure, some people might be scared, but he didn't care about that anymore. The little bit of gratitude and awe he had received told him that he didn't need to hide his appearance. To some extent, it felt disingenuous to pretend to be human still. People would see him as he deserved. With his resolve set, he walked down the hall. The sun was out still, and the light illuminated the hallway. It poured over his face as he passed window after window, but he was stopped by a call from behind. "Wait, how are you feeling?" Recognizing the voice, Mash could hear the concern that poured out of Luna's voice. She had only received a small summary of what had happened and was growing increasingly worried as Arthur still hadn't returned. Feeling bad for his sister, Mash tried to recount the events of the mission. At first, Mash had planned on avoiding talking about what he had done, but that fell apart as he started talking. His sister's concern and worry made him want to share more, and he told her of the people he had killed. Not the monsters, but the people who had died so that he could gain power. Talking through it had felt good, but also reminded him what he had done. He had needed the power to break the cells and gate, but ultimately, he had killed those people for a small bit of power. That was the reality he was struggling to accept. That realization made him realize how pervasive the class system had been before and show him how much it had weakened now. Priscilla told him that the invasiveness had significantly decreased, though she didn't know why. It might be because of his body becoming more monstrous, or perhaps the earrings had gotten stronger. However, he didn't feel like it was any of those. Rather, the system had weakened because he was already set on this course, and even without its intervention he would continue to pursue power. His sister had not said much as he told her the story, but she stayed and listened to the whole thing. Once he finished, all she did was give him a hug. Before letting go, she whispered 2 words to Mash. "Good job." With those words echoing in his mind, he watched as Luna walked away. Mash just stood there for a while longer staring at his hands. A surprising amount of the tension and worry had vanished from her words, almost as if she had healed him. He knew that she didn't and continued towards the door. Now, with a little more confidence behind each step. The streets did a lot to improve his mood. Even with the changes, he was still recognizable, mostly due to the family emblem on the back of his shirt. Several faces had turned to meet him, though many turned away quickly. However, more and more met his gaze and did not shirk away. Mash was certain his gaze would be more frightening now, even though his eyes hadn't changed, his presence had. Even without transforming, his friends had told him that he gave of the same feeling but at a much smaller degree. Mash quickly figured out why, though he could do nothing about his draconic domain. "You should transform. It will be a good display of your power." Priscilla's message made Mash truly notice what was happening. A crowd had been growing as he walked. Even though he walked along the side of the street, Mash noticed that many people had seemed curious. Most of the people were children to boot, though they mainly stayed behind doors and peeked through mall openings in the window. "No, let's just get to the guild." Ignoring the many eyes on his back, Mash continued down the street like royalty might. Other than the royal family, he was probably the most famous person at his rank. Either him or the hero from the Colosseum. Throw in Luke, who was included, as people knew that they were in the same party. Mash was curious as to how he became so famous though, and wondered what had happened over the past couple of hours. Obviously, some news of Arthur's and his exploits would have spread, but this was a bit fast. Mash had heard several people talking about them both, and how their parents must be blessed. The excitement died down quickly though, and by the time he made it to the guild, there was only a trickle of people following him now. He quickly entered the familiar building, happy to see a familiar face in the room. Jack was sitting behind the main desk for some reason, and he quickly flicked his eyes up to meet Mash. Getting the message, Mash headed towards Jack. Jack leaped over the desk, gesturing for Mash to follow him. Without hesitation, Mash followed behind the man, having built up some trust over the past few days. It only took a few moments before they were back in the room where they had appraised the items. Even before Mash had taken a seat, Jack had pulled out a bronze badge. "Congratulations on the rank up, though judging by your expression you got a storm of questions." "Well, good, but first listen to what I have to say, then you can ask what you want." Jack sounded surprisingly serious and familiar with this conversation, so Mash nodded along. This was something that seemed expected, and he was certain Jack would have a lot to share. "I'm all ears." Jack didn't hold anything back, entering his usual teaching mode while giving Mash a ton of information. The conversation took over an hour but had done a lot for Mash's questions. The biggest of which had even been addressed. Mash had assumed for a long time that he had uniquely stumbled upon the class corruption, though that seemed foolish as he heard Jack's words. Apparently, the Adventurers Guild was founded by someone who made similar connections. To notice the effects early was extremely rare, and most only realized at level 100. In the past, the guild would only inform people of it at that level but found that they could better adjust to the changes if they were informed a rank earlier. Originally the guild had told all guild members of the influence, but that had only led to violent reactions from unprepared youths. Most people at his level would know of something, though the kingdom told their people later than the guild did. The reason for this had to do with the way a class affected someone's mind. Apparently, only pure combat classes got the callousness needed to kill. All adventurers experienced it and felt the pull to pursue it. Most unknowingly accepted it as the desire for strength, but a few would find it unnatural. Mash was even more surprised to hear that at level 100, the influence the system had would fundamentally change. This surprised Mash since it meant that it was still present then. From what Jack said, the system would make people do one of two things. Either they would desire the pursuit of power above all else or find themselves beholden to some other force. Knights, paladins, and even heroes fell into the latter category, living for the sake of some other ideal. However, people usually embraced the system as it lined up with their own mentality. This confused Mash, and he asked Jack how this was different from attaining freedom. It sounded like the system just let people follow what they wanted. However, Jack's explanation was more thorough than that and told Mash of the differences. The system created the path for people to walk, leading them to an ideal or purpose that it had created for them. Adventurers were encouraged to kill people and monsters for power, and by the time they hit level 100 already cared more for power than life. All the system did then blocked out dissenting thoughts. This did make Mash wonder how the guild got all this information, but guessed that he wasn't the only one to have something like Priscilla or the earrings. If this was a few months ago, his words would have made Mash furious, but that was not the case now. He knew that this knowledge would do nothing other than cause needless chaos, as most people would likely believe that adventurers were nothing more than murderers. This would probably also make them question their own class and actions and would destabilize their entire foundation. While Jack had given Mash a lot of information, plenty was still hidden. However, Jack was much more open about telling Mash what was hidden. The item from before was still taboo, and he wouldn't tell him about how the guild came across this information. Furthermore, he had no answer as to Mash's question on stats and the consequences of using them when younger. He also kept his lips shut regarding the relationship the guild held with other forces, and that grated at Mash, especially considering what he just learned. What did other groups think of the bloodthirsty and power-hungry nature of the guild, and he also wouldn't share anything about the motivations of any of the groups. He wouldn't even tell Mash about what the guild was trying to accomplish, though he hinted at there being some structure to the system. This conversation did lead to one new topic though, and this information stunned Mash like no other.